I am delighted to see our community gather here today. This symposium has quickly become a highlight of our academic calendar, a time when we come together to celebrate scholarship, creativity, and the pursuit of knowledge across all of our many disciplines. It's one of my favorite days of the year. It's wonderful to look out and see so many of you, so many students, faculty, and staff, and friends of the college, all in one place, ready to share ideas and learn from one another. Thank you for being here and supporting our scholars, and to uphold a spirit of curiosity that defines us on the Hill. Already this morning, there have been so many wonderful presentations. It's hard to choose which ones to attend, at least it was for me, but I decided on the chemistry and history department's capstone presentations by our students, and they were wonderful. It's an absolute celebration of this academic community. Over the years, the Academic Symposium has showcased the incredible work of our students, our staff members, and our faculty, from research projects, creative works, and innovative collaborations. The fact that we're now in the fourth year says to me that we're all about academic excellence and the mentorship that our faculty provide our students. Every one of you here contributes to that environment of learning. I couldn't be more proud or excited to kick off today's keynote lunch program, which promises to further enlighten us all. Before we hear from Dr. Gabor Molnar, there are a few people who would also like to welcome you and share a few words. I'd like to invite our Vice President of Institutional Advancement, Dr. Dave Sears, to the podium.
I was honored today to be a presenter at the symposium this morning. My presentation today was on my dissertation, which focused on the importance of philanthropy and donor interactions with students and how that was important to their social and academic integration in college. In my research, Tinto and post-Tinto researchers spoke about the critical importance of faculty and staff interactions with students to help them build and maintain relationships, persist and complete college, while also building their social and career networks. Our donors here at McDaniel believe in this, in supporting these interactions and expanding experiential learning opportunities. They understand that students learn and grow beyond just the research being done. The students learn to collaborate and interact with faculty, staff, peers, and even people in industry. And that's what makes this academic symposium special. The presenters can share the wisdom they gained through the research, but they can also talk about the relationships that they fostered. So with this in mind, I want to thank all of our donors that supported experiential learning, from study abroad to internships to summer research. In particular, I want to highlight a few recent donors: trustee and alum Julie Lucas Davidian, class of 95, Dr. Jaskin and Dr. Calhoun, and an anonymous donor from the class of 70, who have combined to make gift commitments totaling more than $360,000 in the last 2 months to create and support named experiential learning funds, the Academic Symposium, and the new honors program. So thank you, Julia, Dave, and Julie, and all of our donors for making much of this research that you see here today possible. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Erla. I'm the Assistant Dean of Faculty Development, and I chair the Academic Symposium Steering Committee. And I speak on behalf of the committee to say that it was a joy to read all of your submissions from faculty, staff, and students and create a program that really showcases the talents, inquiries, and a collective devotion to the liberal arts of all of our symposium's presenters. So I want to recognize and thank the members of the Academic Symposium Steering Committee, and I'm going to call them out: Alexander Shampoo Crowley, Mary Jo Colbert, Michelle Gribben, Gerard Kobung, Cheryl Nauer, Michael Polin, Valerie Royer, Jess Victoria, Maureen Williams, and Yenhong Wang. Thank you to our Hoover librarians for staffing the information booth, and to Rob Turning for coordinating the Green Terror's appearance with us. We started planning this event in September, and it truly does take a village to make it happen. I also want to thank and give a round of applause to AVI and our catering services for this lunch. They always do such a great job, so thank you to them. I echo Dave in my sincere gratitude for donors who help make student faculty summer research and this event happen. We truly appreciate your investment in our scholarship. And now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kathy Orzelek-Kroner, Professor of Social Work at McDaniel, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Gabor Molnar. I got the chance to work with Kathy throughout the year to plan Gabor and his wife Mona's visit to our campus, and it was a pleasure to collaborate with her. So thank you to Kathy for your teamwork. And I'm also happy to announce that Kathy was recently shifted to Professor Emeritus status over the weekend during the board meeting.
So I'll begin by saying that this is a really surreal moment for me, and what makes it surreal is that I met our presenter today in Budapest, Hungary, when I was teaching there in the fall of 2023, which was a dream come true. So thanks to the administration, and especially Wendy Morris, if she's here, for acting provost at the time, for making that possible for me. So when I came back from Budapest, I was filled with excitement and passion, and really wanted to generate the interest of more of our students. I know the students that went with me, we all had a life-changing experience, and at McDaniel College, you know, it's part of our mission to change lives. So I was really excited about that, and I reached out to President Jaskin and told her that I had an idea. Now, I thought it was far-reaching. I figured that she would think it was far-fetched. But all the same, I took her the idea of demystifying the Hungarian campus and bringing over a colleague that could meet our students and our faculty and connect with them and perhaps make them feel more comfortable in considering a study abroad experience, especially to Budapest. And I had just the person in mind who is here with us today. So let me tell you how I met Dr. Gabor Molnar. I was talking with him, I met him early on in the semester, actually following the introductory convocation. We were standing in the courtyard and we had about a 20-minute conversation, at which time he educated me on Hungarian history, literature, art, architecture, music, cuisine. But here's the thing. As he made all those comparisons to American history, literature, art, etc. So I started to get nervous. Now, I think most faculty members at some time in their career, usually early on, experience the imposter syndrome, where you're feeling like you're just not smart enough to be a professor. I thought after 10 years of therapy, that was gone. But 20 minutes with Gabor, the monster was back. So I think Gabor, at first I tried to avoid him, by the way, but his class was right after my class. What are the odds, right? So I found Gabor to be the quintessential reflection of the liberal arts. He can talk about everything, as evidenced this week by his participation in a variety of your classes. He talked about thermal baths. He talked about Kafka's The Metamorphosis. He talked about the Rubik's Cube, which, by the way, is a Hungarian invention. So as vast as Gabor's intellect is, so is his heart. And that's where we really connected, around his compassion and care and concern for the world. So it truly is my deepest honor to introduce our esteemed colleague, all the way from Budapest, Hungary, Dr. Gabor Molnar.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. My voice is only breaking because I have a cold. Thank you for this more than generous introduction. And it's really a privilege to be here. And I also want to thank everyone who made it possible for me to be standing here today. President Jaskin, Provost Lily, Chloe, Kathy. I also want to thank all the wonderful faculty who allowed me into your classrooms and hijack part of your classes to promote the study abroad program. I've had a wonderful time here in Westminster, and I'm planning to stay a few more days, so you're not getting rid of me anytime soon. Well, Kathy talked about imposter syndrome, so there you have it. This is how I feel right now. I'm just a boy from Budapest growing up in one of those high-rise housing estates and listening to Metallica back when I was 13 or 14. So there you have it. Light it up. I'll light it up. Another hit erases all the pain. Bulletproof, kill the truth. You're falling, but you think you're flying high, high again. Sold your soul, built a higher wall yesterday. Now you're thrown away. Same rise and fall, who cares at all? Seduced by fame, a moth into the flame. End of quote. These lines, penned by James Hetfield, are from the 2016 Metallica song, Moth into Flame, inspired by Amy Winehouse's tragic life story, and appearing on the album Hardwired to Self-Destruct. The links between the lyrics and the album's title are obvious enough for the songwriter to have claimed in an interview that the song is pretty literal. Hetfield possibly refers to the clarity of the analogy of the celebrity's fame-seeking and the moth's light-seeking behavior, as both display recklessness and an utter disregard for safety, respectability, and longevity. Nevertheless, and with due respect to my boyhood hero, this analogy is still far from being pretty literal. In fact, analogies such as this form the proper basis for metaphor and allegory. Amy Winehouse's story stands as a model for a type of human behavior, and I quote Hetfield's interview, "These days everyone has an obsession with being famous, being popular. Whether it's your Facebook account or walking around the street, watching someone doing selfies of themselves as they're walking down the street, like what? What are you doing?" This is the interview. So the analogy with the moth makes the outcome of the story predictable, forming a cautionary parable around the observed human behavior. In fact, taking analogies between social and natural phenomena as literal may be a sign of ideological blindness. Such literalization seems to suggest that there is a single natural way to read nature. In the emerging field, human-animal studies, there is a strong distrust and even contempt toward allegorical images. This resistance is exemplified by Elizabeth Costello, the main character in J.M. Coates's The Lives of Animals, who argues that figurative language prevents us from seeing animals as they really are, and some critics copy her attitude. They claim that allegory and other similar figures enable humans to see themselves in animals rather than allowing animals to be present as themselves. But does literature have an alternative to using figurative language? Is there not more danger in forgetting that figures of speech are indeed figures of speech and pretending that they literally describe nature? Is it not better to understand multiple ways to turn a natural phenomenon into a meaningful figure? Studying world literature is an exercise in curiosity and humility. When one's perspective is broad enough, any pretense of mastery fades away, and one is left with a sense of embarrassment, facing the richness of linguistic and cultural diversity. While animal behavior is universal, and humans everywhere observe comparable phenomena, the meanings attributed to observed animal behavior may undergo significant variation. Moths and other Lepidoptera seem especially sensitive to allegorical interpretation in various world traditions, especially because of their phototropism. They're drawn to the light. The Japanese comparatist and Middle East expert Hideaki Sugita provides a very helpful overview of several traditions. He reviews the motif of moth and candle in Chinese and Japanese, European and Middle Eastern traditions. Given the deep history of exchange between these diverse cultures in Eurasia, it is difficult to assess to what extent the allegorical tendencies are traceable to a common root. What is most obvious is that people have observed the light-seeking behavior of insects for millennia and wondered why these creatures seem so willing to sacrifice their lives to the flame of a candle or a fireplace. In many traditions, such behavior seems to exemplify different aspects of human behavior. What is striking, however, is that the specific social application as well as the valuation of such behavior can change significantly. The identification between the human soul and Lepidoptera is nowhere more conspicuous than in the etymology of the Greek word psyche and the myth of Psyche, recorded in Apuleius' novel The Golden Ass in the 2nd century in the Common Era. The story of Psyche is generally interpreted as a Platonic allegory of the human soul seeking union with the divine, represented by the winged Cupid flying away after Psyche sneaks a peek of his divine form, despite a clear warning not to do so. The story concludes with Psyche achieving the desired union after much hardship, and this union endows her with wings similar to those of a moth or a butterfly. Aristotle's remark in Historia Animalium confirms that the word psyche means butterfly or moth. Psychology, it seems, is lepidopterology in disguise. I'm sorry, I apologize to the psychologists in the room. Other world traditions also perceive insects' behavior in human terms. Sugita references texts both in the Buddhist and in the Islamic traditions that portray moths plunging into a flame as cautionary parables of deplorable human behavior. Moths are short-sighted, ignorant, or foolhardy creatures that ignore the dangers represented by the flame and pursue earthly desires to their own detriment. They represent hedonism or materialism or sheer stupidity. In Islam, the image of humans as moths catching fire on the day of the striking disaster appears in the Quran in Surah 101, which is elucidated in the Hadith as a moral allegory, showing the burning moths as victims of their own greed and ignorance, lack of self-discipline and controlled focus. It is hard not to identify the flames consuming the moths with the everlasting fire of damnation. The same moral allegory undergoes subtle variations in European tradition. The tone of the cautionary tale is, however, often more rationalistic. The flame does not necessarily represent lust and earthly desires, but rather blind devotion and a lack of critical thought. Sugita cites a passage by Leonardo da Vinci that carries a similar cautionary meaning, using the moth as an example of blind faith and stupidity. In the emblematic tradition developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, the moth flying into the flame may represent very different forms of stupidity. In some images, including a famous 16th century etching by the French Gilles Corrozet, the emblem stands for a lust for battle by those unaware of the horrors of war. In emblems inspired by Protestant theology, on the other hand, moths may be the victims of their unnecessary curiosity. The candle's sole purpose here is to illuminate the pages of the Bible, and the moth that seeks the light of the flame represents abandoning one's everlasting soul in return for the vanity of earthly knowledge. Konrad Meyer's commentary praises conscious disinterest in earthly knowledge, and consequently a trust in the Word of God, as true wisdom. You shouldn't be too curious about the world. You should just trust the Bible. Perhaps not surprisingly, the irresistible attraction of the flame also inspired erotic poetry in various literary traditions, including the Middle East. Sugita quotes, among other examples, a 13th century Syrian poem that uses our image in a playful etiology, explaining the appearance of a beauty spot on the face of the beloved person. The beauty spot in this poem is the burned remains of the lover's heart, having been pulled towards the burning cheeks of the beloved in the shape of a moth. Can you imagine? The lover's heart just jumps to the cheek of the beloved because it cannot resist her. In playful erotic poetry, the valuation of the image inevitably changes, becoming more ambivalent. The moth is no longer simply stupid or ignorant. Its behavior is motivated by a desire that is consistent with the tone of the poem. The heart desires what the heart desires, and the speaker is not in a position to admonish or judge the little insect rushing towards its inevitable fate. This change of tone is also observable in the Sicilian poet Giacomo da Lentini's poem, also from the 13th century. You can see it on the slide. I'm not going to quote it. Lentini is often credited with inventing the sonnet form, and he comes from a school that was most likely influenced by Arabic poetry, Sicily having been under Muslim occupation for 2 centuries before. The influence of Middle Eastern culture on late medieval and Renaissance literature is a subject of much scholarship recently, even including the likely impact of Arabic literature on the structure of Dante's Divine Comedy. Scholars studying the history of the image of the moth and the flame agree that a radical change in the valuation of the image occurred in the Persianate sphere of the Muslim world. Here the image was radically reinterpreted as a mystical allegory. Previously it was a moral allegory, now it's a mystical allegory, in which the moth represents absolute devotion and self-sacrifice. Sugita, as well as the Iranian scholar Nasrollah Purjavadi, locate the shift around the 10th century in the Common Era, especially in the work of the Sufi mystic martyr Mansur al-Hallaj, who utilized the image of the self-immolating moth as a representation of the prophet's ascension to heaven. While ascending, the soul passes through 3 phases representing an increasing closeness to and knowledge of God, and these phases correspond to different stages of the moth's approaching the flame. First, seeing the light, then feeling the heat, and lastly, burning oneself in the divine flame. In the mystical Sufi tradition, the valuation of the image thus changes completely. The cautionary tale is transformed into something like a hortatory one, with the moth now illustrating a behavior worthy of emulation, albeit nearly impossible to imitate. The loss of the moth's life is no longer seen as an unfortunate event or as the result of an error, but as an inevitable step in the process of the mystical union, the annihilation of the self in the union with God. Even within the Persian tradition, a relatively wide range of variation is still possible. In the early 12th century, Hallaj's disciple, Ahmad Ghazali, changed the focus of the story from mystical knowledge or understanding to divine love. In Ghazali's interpretation of the image, in his famous treatment on love, Savane, the idea of annihilation is expressed in religious mystical terms. In this conception, a self requires a beloved to come to full maturity. And it is only through self-sacrifice, the complete abandonment and annihilation of the self, that full maturity or ripeness can be achieved. Ghazali compares the pilgrims circumambulating the Kaaba stone to moths gathering around the flame. In section 39 of his book, this simile is developed into a full allegory of the moth as lover and the flame as beloved, a text to which we will return later. In English translations, the neuter Persian pronoun is often rendered in a gendered way. He for the lover and she for the beloved. In Persian, the third person pronoun is gender neutral, so in the original, there's no he or she. So this change in the English translation emphasizes the erotic, romantic potential in the multi-layered image. The relationship between the lover and the beloved is readable in both a romantic and a religious key, while the narrative of the self-sacrificing moth adds a third dimension that illuminates the other two, but is also irreducible to them. The parable or allegory explains the concept, while also, paradoxically, illustrates its inexplicability, since the achievement of the moth is not knowledge or understanding. If something happens here, you can't explain it, but the image still illustrates it somehow. In fact, the moth achieves a kind of insanity or foolishness that is on the other side of understanding. It's beyond understanding. The moth is therefore seen as a meta-figure, a figure of the impossibility of conceptually explicating mystical or ecstatic experiences. The vocabulary and rhetoric of Ghazali's presentation of the scene of the insect's self-sacrifice influenced an entire literary tradition spanning some centuries. Ghazali himself wrote a literary work anticipating a later work, Farid od-Din Attar's The Conversation of Birds, in which the story of the moth and the flame is retold toward the end of a longer mythical tale of birds looking for their lord and master, the famous Simurgh bird of Persian mythology. Hallaj's earlier three-stage narrative of achieving mystical knowledge is now transformed into a story of three separate moths striking out to gain an understanding of the mystical candlelight. The first one only sees the light from afar. The second one feels the heat of the candle. However, their older, wiser companion pronounces that their knowledge amounts to nothing. A third moth is sent out and burns itself in the flame. The wise one now declares that only this one has attained true knowledge, of which, however, there can be no report. The complexity of the image increases in the heyday of classical Persian literature. Jalaluddin Muhammad Maulana, also known as Rumi, allegedly the best-selling poet in the United States in recent decades, known for his passionate expression of human longing, directly identifies human reason with the light-seeking moth and divinity with the flame that consumes it. He claims that this relationship is essential. A human soul that does not seek the flame is not truly human, and the flame that does not consume it is not truly divine. In Sadi Shirazi, known as an inimitable master of the Persian language, the allegory becomes more interactive as the participants start talking back. In Bustan, the moth is advised not to approach the flame, its mortal enemy, but it responds that it prefers to die at the feet of its beloved rather than keep safely away, as it is in its nature to be drawn to the flame. Even more interestingly, in a second text, the candle is also drawn into the conversation. When the moth complains that it must die in the flame, the candle retorts. I'll read this one in Persian because it's so much nicer. To bogrizi az písejek sole kham, man estadem ta besúzem tamam. Tora ateşe eşk agar pár besúcht, már abin, ke ez pajeta szár besúcht. In English, you run away from a mere flame, I stand here until I am completely burned. It is your wings that are charred in the fire of love. Look at me. I burn from head to toe. The candle is another player in the seemingly endless chain of separation and longing, ruled by radical asymmetry. It would be nice to talk about this longer, but I have to move on. The various layers of meaning going well beyond what is outlined here allowed the image of the moth to be incorporated into the complex imagery of classical Persian poetry, which is famous for its deliberate confusion of religious and erotic, mystical and romantic notions. Nowhere is this playful confusion more prevalent than in the poetry of the 14th century master Hafez, who makes numerous uses of the motif, invoking pre-existing literary traditions while playfully obfuscating the meaning. Let us recall but two of his references to moths and flames. A famous couplet from one of his ghazals read, I'll only read the English translation now, in Dick Davis's translation, and fire is not what gently smiles from candles' flames. It's what annihilates the flocking moths that flutter around his shrine. Dick Davis's translation adds to the original, deliberately reminding the reader of the religious connotations of the image. Another poem more strongly highlights the erotic connotations. This one begins with the line, pay attention, nobody can find release from the lasso of the curls of your hair. It's clearly an erotic kind of complaint about the cruelty of one's beloved. But this one also has the couplet, Behavadari an sem csopárvan ez a súg, ta ne szúzi, to ne jabi íze gámi esk halász. That is, Until you burn of desire in pursuit of that candle as a moth, you will not find an escape from the sorrow of love. You have to burn yourself in the fire to find escape from sorrow. The image is playfully polyvalent, open to mystical as well as more directly erotic interpretations. One thing is clear, however, and this is where we come to world literature. It is this poem that once it becomes translated to German by Josef Hammerpurgstall, directly inspired Goethe. One of the most famous poems in Goethe's West-East Divan, first published in 1814, is a poem called Selige Sehnsucht, or Holy Longing in Robert Bly's translation. There's a lot of alternative translations, blissful yearning, holy yearning, and so on, in which an immolated butterfly or moth learns to die and become, serving as a symbol of transformation. This line, die and become, stirb und werde in German, is one of the the best-known cliches of German poetry. The two poems have much in common. In Goethe's poem, the transformation is eroticized, but may be more closely related to poetic creativity than either to pure eroticism or to religious mysticism. The publication of Goethe's famous collection was certainly not the first occasion that Middle Eastern and European poetic traditions intersected. I must mention here that Hafez's work was first translated into a European language by a Hungarian, you guessed, a diplomat named Károly Revicki in the 1770s, who translated them from Persian to Latin. A Hungarian poet, Mihály Csokonai Vitéz, also wrote a poem praising Hafez more than a decade before Goethe's famous poem was published. However, Goethe's collection appeared at a time when Western Orientalism was on the rise, and the inspiration he drew from Arabic and Persian poetry brought salient differences and connections between various traditions into focus. The scholar and translator Josef Hammerpurgstall, who translated the poem I talked about a minute ago, in his book on the history of eloquence in Persia, used our image, the image of the moth or butterfly, Schmetterling, it can be both. The Persian word parvane can also be both moth and butterfly, to highlight the contrast between Eastern and Western poetic traditions in the following way. And I quote him. The butterfly or moth, on the other hand, always flies around the light, which sometimes laughs, sometimes weeps, depending on whether the flame flares up or the wax melts, and in whose glow it finally consumes itself. For the Oriental, then, the butterfly or moth is not, like the Occidental, a symbol of fickleness and fluttering, but rather a symbol of the most faithful, devoted, self-forgetting, and self-sacrificing love, and the contrasting polarity of East and West, which proves itself everywhere, even in the smallest details, is strikingly apparent here. Western and Eastern lands, Abend- und Morgenländer, stand apart from each other as the Occident is from the Orient. It's kind of a difficult concept to understand. So the moth becomes once again a meta-symbol, a symbol of Oriental poetic imagery, highlighting the conflict between any Western understanding of an individual image versus the placement of the same image within a complex and self-referential system of traditional Persian poetry. The poem attributed to Hafez that in German translation inspired Goethe's poem is an extremely refined example of this poetic tradition, in which the moth's devotion to the candle may be seen as a mystical, erotic, or perhaps even a political act, as the beloved's identity is never fully clarified within the text. So they, this person, may be a beautiful person, an earthly ruler, or even a divine essence. And one may even stand for the other, since a beautiful face or a just and merciful ruler in this tradition may testify to divine principles such as beauty or grace. The closing of Hammerpurgstall's paragraph seems tautological, highlighting the desire to separate and generalize. This is what Orientalism is. Nevertheless, this quote also underscores the relevance of our little image for world literature. A single phenomenon observed in an intersection of the human and the natural world has inspired prophets, thinkers, poets, and songwriters from different parts of the world to probe for meaning in and beyond the observable world. Much of the story I have told you so far is derived from second-hand sources, general articles and books surveying this motif in world literature or in the Persian tradition in particular. My own original research, which I'm planning to turn into a book soon, I'm going on sabbatical next year from my other job, so I'm under pressure now. So my own original research focuses on less obvious connections between word traditions. The continued relevance of the death of the moth motif in modern Western texts that may or may not acknowledge a direct debt to Persian or Oriental sources. I tentatively call my approach subjunctive philology, which means reading my authors as if they were inspired by non-Western traditions. Some of my sources include philosophical texts such as Gaston Bachelard's writings on the psychoanalysis and the poetics of fire, Martin Heidegger's remarks on the moth in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, and the Italian thinker Giorgio Agamben's commentary on Heidegger, in which he calls the image of the self-immolating moth the most ancient symbol of unio mystica, without referencing any non-European sources. The literary works relevant for my subject include writings by Charles Baudelaire, Virginia Woolf, Rainer Maria Rilke, Vladimir Nabokov, or A.S. Byatt, the British writer. In Thomas Pynchon's great American novel, Gravity's Rainbow, there are two references to a moth plunging into a flame, or more precisely, a moth refusing to plunge into a flame. The motif in that novel is identified with Rilke's poetry, but the Rilke poem quoted in the novel does not have a moth in it. There is some textual evidence to suggest that Pynchon deliberately mixes up Rilke and Goethe in the mind of his deplorable German-speaking character. This is a Nazi who's thinking about moths in the novel. Pynchon's encyclopedic novel also owes a lot to modern inventions in technology. One of Pynchon's acknowledged primary sources, Norbert Wiener's The Human Use of Human Beings, describes a machine developed to test different functions of tropism and feedback called the moth bedbug machine, which was designed to either run toward the flame or away from toward the light or away from the light, based on which side of the machine received an overload of signals. This was used in therapy for neurological illnesses. One of Pynchon's recurrent themes is the almost mystical modern devotion to science and technology, which culminated in the Nazi period. The moth in Gravity's Rainbow, a novel taking place in this period, is a fitting symbol of this dual nature of modernity. In some works, such as in Virginia Woolf's famous last essay, The Death of the Moth, or in the German-British writer W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz, moths do not plunge into a flame. Nevertheless, even these works tend to highlight the last moments of the insects' lives. In Sebald's work, moths are the subject of a long lecture by an amateur Welsh naturalist. The lecture presents moths as almost otherworldly, unique and mysterious creatures that appear out of nothingness, produce visual effects confusing human senses, and in general inhabit the border between the material and the immaterial worlds. This border is described as a subtle silk cloth. Silk is identified both with moths, since it's moths that produce silk, and also with Orientalism, especially in Sebald's other celebrated book, The Rings of Saturn. Moths are also contrasted to humans because they are capable of regulating their temperature, unlike humans, described in the novel as constantly finding themselves in a slightly feverish, almost overheated condition. That's us, according to Sebald. Combustion, incineration, burning, Verbrennung is the German word he uses, is a crucial theme in Sebald's work, both as a critique of the human use of natural resources, burn everything to produce energy, and a specific reference to 20th century wars and genocide. He clearly suggests that burning is not specific to moths, but to humans. In Sebald, the moth plunging into a flame is always Psyche, the human soul. The third case I would like to discuss in a little more detail is the Pittsburgh-born American writer Annie Dillard, a nature writer with mystical tendencies, who just celebrated her 80th birthday a few days ago, 30th of April, if I remember correctly. Moths and other insects play an important role in several of her works, including her biography, An American Childhood, and the book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. This is a nature book. Most relevantly, in 1976, she wrote a short essay narrative called Death of a Moth, widely anthologized and often compared with Virginia Woolf's similarly titled text in college writing classes. I don't know if there's anyone in the room who did this exercise, compare Virginia Woolf with Annie Dillard. It's in some college essay books. Unlike Virginia Woolf, Dillard has her moth plunge into the flame and provides a brutally detailed description of the events. I hope you're done eating, because this is going to be a little difficult. This text also became part of Dillard's book, Holy the Firm, in which the religious mystical concerns are of crucial importance. In the book, a young girl named Julie Norwich, a thinly veiled reference to the medieval English nun Julian of Norwich, is burned and disfigured in an airplane accident. The narrator repeatedly uses fire as a metaphor for divinity, with explicit references to Christian theological traditions. On the other hand, Dillard's observations on insect life often relate to reproduction, which indirectly links the image to sexuality and the erotic tradition of this image. Lepidoptera, such as butterflies and moths, are often semelparous, meaning that the adult animal's primary goal is reproduction, after which the individual dies. Sexual union is achieved at the cost of the animal's life, which structurally parallels the symbolic union achieved by plunging into the candlelight. In Dillard's book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, an entire chapter is devoted to the concept of fecundity, which is described as a simultaneously fascinating and horrifying aspect of biological life. Dillard identifies this phenomenon mostly with insect and invertebrate life, and the chapter begins with a description of a dream of watching two Luna moths mate. This is very Nabokovian, by the way. A sight which, I quote, was the perfect picture of utter spirituality and utter degradation. The chapter of fecundity follows on an earlier chapter called The Fixed, that also considers insects as creatures enslaved by instinct and automated reflexes, which is how the moth's phototropic behavior has been etologically interpreted, even by Heidegger in the foundational concepts of metaphysics, though the philosopher is tempted by the mystic's understanding as well. In the chapter Fecundity, Dillard considers the immense pressure of growth on natural life and contrasts the quick, swarming life and death of insects with the human appreciation of individual life. This contrast, she suggests, is one of the main reasons why we find animal fecundity so terrifying. And I quote her again, "Evolution loves death more than it loves you or me," unquote. And this is the most radical expression of this insight into the alien character of a fecund, sexually prolific nature. The term love makes the connections between the theological considerations and the literary image even more complex, illustrating the thematic variability of the term in the literary tradition. In the text, Death of a Moth, the observation of nature coincides with the scene of reading. The presence of reading within the reading suggests that, unlike James Hetfield's claim from before, there cannot be a literal meaning to the text. Every act of sense-making is mediated through culture, even when nature is directly observed. The narrator retreats to a forest campsite to rekindle her passion for writing by reading a book called The Day on Fire by James Ullman, inspired by the biography of the prodigious French poet Arthur Rimbaud. I would like to read this text a little more closely, as we do in my world literature classes in Budapest, to appreciate the finer points of Dillard's writing. So I read, lost, every day sitting under a tree by my tent, while warblers swung in the leaves overhead, and bristleworms trailed their inches over the twiggy dirt at my feet. And I read every night by candlelight, while barred owls called in the forest and pale moths massed round my head in the clearing where my light made a ring. Moths kept flying into the candle. They hissed and recoiled, lost upside down in the shadows among my cooking pans. Or they singed their wings and fell, and their hot wings, as if melted, stuck to the first thing they touched, a pan, a lid, a spoon, so that the snagged moths could flutter only in tiny arcs, unable to struggle free. These I could release by a quick flip with a stick. In the morning I would find my cooking stuff gilded with torn flecks of moth wings, triangles of shiny dust here and there on the aluminum. So I read, and boiled water, and replenished candles, and read on. As she reads by candlelight, moths keep flying into her candle and burning themselves. At first, these creatures are of no concern to the narrator. Her indifference at the end is really remarkable here. I read on. Their deaths are just footnotes to her reading, and they seem to confirm nature's profligacy asserted in Dillard's previous book. They may also recall the emblem by Conrad Meyer that I showed you earlier, in which the moths flew to the candle instead of reading the text illuminated by the candle flame. The blind stupidity of nature seems to be contrasted to the passion of the human spirit, even when nature frames a scene of reading on poetry. Something changes, however, when a larger-than-life insect appears and plunges into the flame. One night, a moth flew into the candle, was caught, burned dry, and held. I must have been staring at the candle, or maybe I looked up when a shadow crossed my page. At any rate, I saw it all. A golden female moth, a biggish one with a 2-inch wingspan, flapped into the fire, dropped her abdomen into the wet wax, stuck, flamed, frazzled, and fried in a second. Her moving wings ignited like tissue paper, enlarging the circle of light in the clearing and creating out of the darkness the sudden blue sleeves of my sweater, the green leaves of jewelweed by my side, the ragged red trunk of a pine. At once the light contracted again, and the moth's wings vanished in a fine, foul smoke. At the same time, her 6 legs clawed, curled, blackened, and seized, disappearing utterly. And her head jerked in spasms, making a spattering noise. Her antennae crisped and burned away, and her heaving mouth parts crackled like pistol fire. When it was all over, her head was, so far as I could determine, gone the long way of her wings and legs. Had she been new or old? Had she mated and laid her eggs? Had she done her work? All that was left was the glowing horn shell of her abdomen and thorax, a fraying, partially collapsed gold tube jammed upright in the candle's round pool. I should have issued a trigger warning, I suppose. The first paragraph contains a naturalistic description of the moth's death, in which the figurative language is mainly used for direct representation and effect, as is evident from the intensifying sequence of parallelisms, the similes, as well as the alliterations and other sound effects. I hope you caught them as I read them out. At the end of the description, the narrator indicates the parallels between the female moth and the female observer by asking questions relating to the reproductive duties expected of a female of the species, highlighting the contrast between these expectations and those of the writer, the nun or the martyr. Had she mated and laid her eggs? Had she done her work? Devoting oneself to the flame interferes with the task of mating and interrupts the chain of reproduction. And then this moth essence, this spectacular skeleton, began to act as a wick. She kept burning. The wax rose in the moth's body from her soaking abdomen to her thorax to the jagged hole where the head should be, and widened into flame, a saffron yellow flame that roped her to the ground like any immolating monk. That candle had 2 wicks, 2 flames of identical height, side by side. The moth's head was fire. She burned for 2 hours until I blew her out. She burned for 2 hours without changing, without bending or leaning, only glowing within like a building fire glimpsed through silhouetted walls, like a hollow saint, like a flame-faced virgin gone to God, while I read by her light, kindled, while Rimbaud in Paris burned out his brains in 1,000 poems, while night pooled wetly at my feet." Unquote. The first sequence of this quote is perhaps the most unique, as it continues the morbidly naturalistic description with an observation that clarifies the figurative significance of the scene. Here, metaphor becomes the dominant figure, but the text derives its metaphors from an observed transformation. The exoskeleton of the insect is now a wick. It is not like a wick, but is acting as a wick. It's not a simile, it's a metaphor. The moth's insides are wax, and the head is a flame. The curious metamorphosis results in a doubling of the candle as the insect turns into a second candle by becoming one with the original one which had killed her. The candle had 2 wicks, 2 flames of identical height, etc. When further similes are used, they no longer emphasize the naturalness of the scene, but they point beyond it to further double the image. The saffron yellow flame, a very Persian color, by the way, saffron. The saffron yellow flame reminds the narrator of a self-immolating monk. It is at this point of this metaphorical unification that Dillard's text comes closest to the Persian literary tradition by probably unwittingly repeating a motif that underscores the image of the moth being identified as a symbol of the union, the mystical union. This motif is the mutual feeding of the fire and the moth. In Ahmad Ghazali's Savaneh, the term gut, nutriment or nourishment, is utilized to characterize the relationship between the insect and the flame, here identified as figures standing for the lover and the beloved. And here's a part about the power of flight. I'm going to skip this, but I'll show you the quote from Ghazali. So this is about the moth feeding the flame once it's reached the flame. Previously, the flame feeds the moth, allowing it to fly, so it gives it energy. But once the union is achieved, the situation is reversed, and now it's the moth that feeds the flame. So if the achieved union is temporary and asymmetrical, then the image also opens itself up to an ironic or pointedly literary reading. Here exemplified by the fact that in the act of unification, the candle is in fact doubled. Right? So they unite, but in fact the candle is doubled. That candle had 2 wicks, 2 flames of identical height, side by side. 2 equals 1 equals 2 seems to be the solution to this mathematical problem. Toward the end of our passage, the image is further multiplied, but this multiplication can also be understood as the spreading of a homogeneous and homogenizing medium, that is the flame. It seems that the shadows of the chitinous shell, illuminated by the flame, reveal the religious images of the saint and the virgin, while the flame which bursts from the moth skeleton spreads to the soul of the narrator, observing herself as she reads, to the poet hero of the book that she is reading, and to the whole night, which melts like candle wax into a pool, framing the scene of reading. There is a particular contradiction in the figurality of the scene. As a result of the union of the moth and the candle, everything is set alight, dissolving in a homogeneous medium of fire. Dillard is very much aware of both the mystical and the ironic potential of her own text, as evidenced by her later reflections in an essay called How I Wrote the Moth Essay and Why. Here she confirms the association of the self-immolating insect with different levels of human behavior, including the poet's devotion to his art, the mystic's negation of the self, and the martyr's sacrifice. Dillard uses the image of fire in a metafigurative sense, since it is this image that unifies different levels of meaning and experience in the text. Nevertheless, if the image of spreading fire unifies the tone of the passage, it also draws attention to the ambiguity of the unifying principle and the inescapable difference between the various levels of experience and nuances of meaning. Is really a poet's devotion to his work the same as a martyr's self-sacrifice? Both are fire, but are they really the same thing? This ambiguity is also expressed by suggestions of the narrator's complicity in the moth's death and other moth's deaths before her. Her reading mind is kindled by the body of the moth. Her writing acquires meaning from the death of the moth, which I once helped to kill, as she says in the text. If the interpretive model outlined by the author works by analogy, that is by metaphor, moth equals poet equals nun equals martyr, and the analogies are preceded by a moment of contact when the death of the moth provides the illumination necessary for the creation of this very model. The moth in the text spreads light in the forest clearing and spreads metaphors throughout the text. The narrator is both the recipient of this illumination and the indirect cause of the moth's death. Her transfiguration of this experience into a piece of literature, this text was also published under the title Transfiguration. So the transfiguration of this experience into a piece of literature both completes the metaphorical model, the artist lights up the world, and betrays its profound ambiguity. The candle was lit in the forest so that the narrator can read, and the moth or moths died as a consequence. If the moth's death illuminates the pages we read, Dillard's text also illuminates the immense complexity of a simple image when seen in the context of world literature and the history of contacts between Eastern and Western literary traditions. Such complexity demands in the study of world literature a combination of close readings, attentive to the essential complications and rhetorical operations, on the one hand, and on the other, contextual investigations aware of the historical and cultural diversity of prevailing interpretive strategies. In world literature, no text is ever just literal, not even a Metallica song. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we do have time if there are any questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones set up, so you're welcome to come and ask your question there.
Thank you for that tour de force. This is wonderful. We need a seminar. We need you here for a year to give us a seminar on the topic. I don't know if he is unique. I don't need a microphone.
No, we need to. Yeah, the recording needs a microphone.
I'm sorry. I don't know if he is unique in your list of Eastern and Western authors, but Nabokov may be the one who was also a lepidopterist of professional standing, and whose I want to say principal amusement was really the collection and the pinning of butterflies and so on. And I think it played a really important role in his conception of Lolita. He uses the terminology of the nymph. He has a protagonist who is fatally drawn, where you have the sort of the conflation of the eroticism of the drive and also a kind of perverse mystical union. So I wonder if is that where you're headed in the chapter on Nabokov?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Faulkner. Yes, in short, yes, you hit the nail on the head. Of course, I'm thinking about Lolita, but also other Nabokov stories such as Pale Fire, where there's also there the appearance of the butterfly kind of marks. It's kind of a ghost story in some ways. Pale Fire is extremely complicated. It has all kinds of interpretive issues that are still unresolved to a certain extent. But there is a moment in there where a character is led on a trip by a butterfly, and that, if I remember correctly, I don't want to say anything that I can't remember specifically, but it's something like that character is led on a journey that leads her to the other side. So the butterfly there is an indication of death or mortality, That just like in Sebald, that limit between the physical world and another world. Lolita is, of course, also the name of a species of butterfly. In the novel Ada or Ardor, the main characters, I think I showed it for a second on the slides. Nabokov plays on this pun, insect and incest. So there's two siblings or half siblings, I don't remember exactly, and they have this perverse relationship, just like the one in Lolita. And the female there collects moths, actually caterpillars, and watches them mate, and even forces them to mate at one point. Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah, I heard about it. I know that he was hired there to actually curate the collection. So he was. He didn't have a degree in entomology, I believe, but through his studies, he really achieved prestige in that field. Thank you for the question.
Just like Tom, I'd like to thank you for the real tour de force that this is to do. In terms of more modern or contemporary literature, any example in terms of feminist takes on the moth? I've never read it, which doesn't mean much, but because I could think of it as highly problematic, certainly as you're supposed to.
Thank you for the question. I don't know any more recent examples than Annie Dillard. Her example is relevant, I think, in terms of the gender of the moth. But I've been touring the world with this in a way. I gave a presentation on Dillard in Lisbon. I also gave another presentation in Belgrade last year, and I'm receiving some suggestions from people from around the world. So I know some examples from, at least I have them in my email, Portuguese literature and South African literature from experts of the field. So when I complete the book, I'm going to incorporate all those examples. And I encourage anyone here, when you come across an example like this, please don't hesitate to email me, because I will probably credit you in my book, at least in the acknowledgement section, if you send me some relevant examples. Yeah. So thank you once again.
Thank you, everyone. All right, thank you all for coming. Please enjoy the rest of the day. There are plenty of sessions this afternoon, so thank you again.